Folks, good morning, good evening. I guess I should say good afternoon as well. For those joining us for our MPoC webinar today, we're going to give it another minute or so to get going. So let's just wait for others to jump in, and we'll start talking about a topic that we're really excited about at Imperium.
Yes. Shall we already throw up the first poll for the people in the waiting room?
Yeah, let's do it, Tim. Folks, while we wait for another minute or two for folks to join, poll question coming your way. Have some fun before we start talking about MPoC.
I think the timing with this question is utterly brilliant. So
Yeah.
Who's been paying attention? So as people come in, we also see the first.
Yep, I see them answering. 75% believe PCI. Oh, 80% will be published this year. Oh, okay. So I think it's going down. I think people have just started to realize we just landed yesterday. All right, get going, Tim. Folks,
this is a good start. So while we were not aware that the standard was actually to be published yesterday, because we defined these questions in the course of this week, let's call it coincidence, the standard was actually published yesterday, so this kind of outdates this question. But it's good to see that the standard is here. So this also gives all of us, all the people in the webinar, but also the developers, the opportunity to now have full access to the standard and understand what's actually coming your way when you're intending to develop a SoftPOS solution.
No, absolutely, Tim. Folks, thank you for joining. As Tim mentioned, clearly, the timing is impeccable. The new MPoC standard dropped last night, and we wanted to spend some time to talk about why the standard matters when you talk about point of sale, and why it matters from a security standpoint. What are the things that will need to change for those developing point of sale mobile apps, and how do you start addressing the things, and where do you start addressing the requirements for this compliance? So let me just introduce the speakers. My name is Krishna Vishnubhatla. I'm a product manager at Imperium. My goal is to essentially drive the vision of our mobile application security products. And with me, I have our own Tim Hartog. Now, Tim, you are specialist on the mobile app security side on Imperium, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what you did before Imperium and why it's so relevant to what we're talking about?
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. I'm Tim Hartog. Before Imperium, I worked at one of the security labs, Riskier in this case, and there we created the mobile security team, doing all the security certifications for mobile wallets. But since 2016, 2017, also the SoftPOS solutions. So tap to phone, tap on phone, depending which brand you're speaking to. And that moved effectively to the different PCI standards, with the end result now being MPoC. I joined Imperium in the beginning of this year, focusing on what we call our mobile application protection suite, working closely with Krishna on the product management side. And in this context, within Imperium, I'm also focusing on most of the fintech related partners we effectively work with, and with a strong focus also on SoftPOS.
Perfect. Give me a second. All right. Okay, so the agenda. So, folks, as you mentioned, one, we wanted to talk a little bit about the evolution of the payment space. As a lot of you are familiar, if you're already in the space, we have come a long way from cash registers to now allowing payments on a mobile app on a COTS device. We want to spend a few minutes understanding that evolution because obviously that's the hardware, the software, and just the buying behavior itself of the world has changed, and that's what's driving MPoC. Second, the what and why of MPoC. Why is this important? What in this compliance is game changing? And then if you are a SoftPOS developer, what are the things you have to now contend with, right? What changed fundamentally for you? And then where do you start looking for answers for some of the things that you have to contend with? And from Zimperium's perspective, at the end, we'll spend a few minutes just talking about how are we aligning ourselves with MPoC, right? Now, before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A tab. We'll gladly answer simple questions that we can. If any of these questions require a little bit more deeper conversation, we will get back to you after the webinar as much as possible. All right. Tim, with that, obviously, we've come a long way, like I mentioned, from stationary cash registers to all the way to, accepting payments on a consumer mobile device, right? Why don't you talk us a little bit about what this evolution has looked like?
Yeah, I think from my own perspective, because I was involved already on the early days with Tap to Phone, I might have a little bit of a biased view. But what you might have seen as a player essentially in the fintech space is that the point of interaction or point of sale systems have evolved over the past years, and that has gone quite rapidly in the past, let's say 10 years, moving from really built for purpose, rigid devices, not the prettiest ones, let's say, to more SmartPOS devices, which are actively already Android-based, but they're not really smartphone-based. But with the introduction of Tap to Phone in 2017, with the first vendor at that moment in time developing such a solution, we have kind of seen an acceleration in terms of how contactless payments and smartphones have gone together to essentially enable using your smartphone as an acceptance device. Maybe for those who are new to Tap to Phone, SoftPOS, PCI, CPoC, MPoC, and CPoC and MPoC. What we have seen happening in the past 5-6 years is effectively a technology which was coming to the market. First, it has been trialed quite a lot with the payment brands, and those experiences effectively resulted in the different PCI standards. So first you had Tap to Phone without actual PIN entry. That led to what we call the contactless payment on COTS standard, which is effectively using your smartphone to receive contactless transactions, contactless payments, but it didn't support PIN yet. The standard which PCI already developed prior to that in 2018 was the so-called SPoC standard, so secure PIN on COTS devices. But that was still requiring a physical hardware device, the card reader, to interact with the card, and you'd use your smartphone purely for the PIN entry part. Both standards were not fully what the market was effectively asking for. In 2018, 2019, the payment brand started experimenting with the Tap to Phone technology, also allowing PIN entry, so supporting transactions as effectively above the CVM limit. And these different tracks essentially resulted in the standard which was published yesterday. So the PCI MPoC standard, where MPoC stands for Mobile Payment on COTS. And this standard is effectively what is now new, and it's quite a different standard compared to the previous SPoC and CPoC standards, and that's what we'll address more today.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating, right, Tim? I think early on there was a lot of push from the payment schemes, right? The move to credit cards without the chip to chip, which was more liability driven. But in the last couple of years, the trend that you're talking about seems to have been one, enabling retailers and stores to conduct more business, door-to-door business, become mobile.
Yeah.
Now the last set of change seems like with the pandemic, everything we've accelerated, and that's more buyer behavior. We've figured out that convenience is a huge driver of business. And that's been the big push.
Yeah, what you've seen is that with the transition to EMV-based cards, so the chip and PIN or the contactless, that's much more driven from a security perspective. Whereas the technology, once the technology became more adopted in especially Europe, APJ, also other parts of the world, the US following slowly as well, we see that opened up the opportunity essentially for new technological innovation in the payment space, and that came to be with tap to phone. The tap to phone technology was not so much introduced from a security perspective like chip and PIN was, but much more from a ability to or a drive to enable merchants, small merchants, micro merchants, to effectively also accept digital payments, digital transactions instead of always having to use cash. What we've seen is that opportunity for enabling small and micro merchants has also been recognized by larger retailers, by high-end retailers, by all sorts of parties where payments are relevant. And I think you see the interest in tap to phone across the board, even in adjacent industries such as ticketing or identification or other means. So there's quite a large opportunity in terms of how this technology can be used.
Great. Security posture. You touched on it a little bit. On the slide we had. Seems like in the past we had the security blanket of a specialized device, and now you have to trust the Apples, the Samsungs, the LGs on hardware and their ability to keep these payment transactions and your payment data safe, right? I mean, is one really better than the other?
I think the best way of saying it is that they're different. So what you see with the traditional built-for-purpose devices, so the device in this case on the left-hand side, which I think everyone will recognize as a payment terminal, the whole security model there is that you rely on the device itself for the security. So this includes a secured casing with tamper detection, so physical tamper detection if the case is being opened or if someone is trying to get access to the PCB. Sometimes the chips in the PCB are encased in epoxy, making it very difficult for an attacker with physical access to tamper with the device, to connect with the PCB or connect with the memory or the chip. And that was effectively the security model for these devices. So physical tamper detection, also all sorts of physical countermeasures to make it more difficult for someone to tamper with these devices. This model doesn't really apply with smartphones. So in the left-hand side, there's less focus on the actual payment application. The main reliance on software is in the platform itself, the physical casing and the secure chipset inside there. But with smartphones, you don't have these security measures effectively in the device itself. So this is kind of turning the paradigm around from trusting the device to secure your software to run secure software on any device. Because that's also an important angle to realize. With the payment terminals, you had a built-for-purpose device, which was only one device. You know what type of hardware is in there, what type of chip is in there, what the operating system is, what the patch level is, etc. With smartphones, we're not talking about one device. You could be talking about hundreds or thousands of devices of different smartphone vendors, different models, different OS versions, even different operating systems, different patching levels. It's quite a challenge already alone to develop something for so many devices, let alone to depend on these devices to provide the security for your SoftPOS solution, SoftPOS application. So the model is effectively turned around there. You cannot rely on the platform to provide the security for your application. The application has to be protected in such a way that it even can operate securely if the device, the smartphone, is fully controlled by the attacker. So that's a complete paradigm shift from trusting the hardware and the device to not trusting the hardware and the device and making sure that the application itself is secure enough.
Yeah.
So let's move to the second polling question.
Folks, I do see some questions coming up in the Q&A. We will come back to it at the end and walk through these questions. Some of the answers to your questions are in some of our next slides, so we will definitely address them. Right, so the question that's up for everyone is, with SoftPOS expected to scale up, which platforms do you plan to target to support with your SoftPOS solution? We'll give everybody a minute to answer the poll. Get a few more seconds for people to get it in. All right, just to keep moving, I see that 100% say both Android and iOS, Tim. So
yeah, that's interesting. It's not that big of a surprise because we've seen this starting effectively on Android and then specifically on what we call GMS Android, so the Google Mobility Services certified Android devices, which are effectively your consumer devices. Apple launched its, what is it called, Tap to iPhone solution not too long ago. So you see two platforms effectively now dominating this space. But I think with some time, you will also see that the third option, so next to iOS and Android, things like Windows, tablets, enterprise devices with Android on there, Harmony OS, Linux-based devices. We've seen quite some interest in supporting these type of solutions as well. And this makes it challenging probably for solution developers of how do you develop a solution which you can use for any or most of the platforms you want to support instead of developing a unique solution for every platform you want to develop or support.
Actually, 7% of folks have actually said outside they are looking into some of the other platforms. So definitely, I mean, Android and iOS itself are a challenge. Now you throw in the other platforms, right? I think it doesn't get any easier. Well, clearly, MPoC, I think when we talk about it, any point of sale solution, the path to market has always been a topic of conversation, right? Because there are some things you have to do to get to the market and then thrive. Why don't you spend a little bit to say, what does this road look like? How is it changing, right?
Yeah, I think for most of the participants in this webinar who have already gone through the brand programs with the tap to phone or tap on phone pilot programs, or with an SPOC or a CPOC solution, they would recognize this process. But there's quite some steps to be taken when you actually go from the idea of developing something to having a product in your hands which you can actually deploy into the market through the app stores. It is not to be underestimated how significant the effort can be to actually develop and certify these type of solutions. So putting it in a nutshell, once you have an idea and you start development, effectively your solution will be tested from both a functional perspective, typically referred to as L2 testing. So this is interoperability, performance, compatibility. Then there's security testing, which is a vital aspect in these solutions, whether that's for the previous TAP programs, but also for the PCI programs. And regardless of what you do, it will lead to some sort of approval or certification. And once you have that, you can effectively start offering your solution in the market. In most cases, or some cases, you also have end-to-end testing there, also referred to level 3 testing, but for simplicity purposes, I left it out in this picture. But when we look to MPoC specifically, you'll see that the actual security testing part there, the security requirements, the way the requirements are written and interpreted. That's going to be the biggest change for the developers in this space, moving from the pilot programs or a SPOC and CPOC solution towards MPoC. And with these changes, this effectively also impacts your certifiability. What that will precisely mean, we'll get to in the next 2 or 3 slides. But the changes in MPoC are quite significant, and they impact the likelihood or the challenge to get certified. However, if you do get certified, you have a solution which supports many different types of functionalities. It's almost a full payment terminal solution, so you can support PIN, you can do offline transactions. So a full product which is effectively being asked from the market now. So the scale of your potential deployments, the scale of your market, that's growing significantly with MPoC compared to SPoC or CPoC. However, in order to get there, you also need to make sure, you also need to make sure that you address these requirements in your actual development process. Because if you don't look back in terms of, I already have a solution, I want to go for MPoC, then it's probably going to be a very challenging process to get your solution certified. So make sure to have a very deep dive in the standard, the requirements which were published yesterday, and take that into consideration in your development. So what that effectively means, and this is a good question, why do we have another standard? Isn't CPoC and SPoC enough? Effectively, no. So the intention with MPoC is already there to replace the existing standards. CPoC was limited in terms of what it would offer to solution developers and users, as you would still have the external secure card reader PIN. That was SPoC. CPoC was limited in that it did not support PIN entry. And what you see with MPoC is that it kind of enables support for both the CPoC and SPoC use cases, but it also allows you to combine native NFC capabilities with PIN on the same device. So effectively a tap-to-phone with PIN solution or a complete SoftPOS solution. So that in terms of the functionality it provides, it becomes a more full-fledged payment terminal. And that's effectively also where we see the need in the market arise. 2 other things which are important is that the SPoC and CPoC standards, they were quite limited in terms of what you could certify. So you only had a concept of being a complete solution provider, which was responsible for the requirements which are applicable to the technical development, but also the day-to-day operations afterwards in the market. And that's quite limiting, I would say, from a business case perspective, because we quite often see different vendors having different intentions of what they want to offer. Sometimes it's just a software, sometimes it's an SDK, sometimes it's a full offering, sometimes they want to use it within their own business or context. And we see that with the MPoC standards, this modularity and the certification options which are effectively attached to that are more taken into account.
So Tim, clearly, the last 2 things we are highlighting, right? The requirements are changing, and that is primarily because the attack surfaces will change, right? Mobile exposes you to the elements. Why don't you take a minute to kind of talk about both these things?
Yeah, what we saw with the SPoC and the CPoC standard is that they had 2 flaws effectively, or 2 things which could be improved. Always look on the upside at it. So the SPoC and CPoC standard were relatively prescriptive or very prescriptive, and that has 2 implications. On one side, it takes away the developer freedom for the actual solution developer, but on the second side, it can also have a negative impact from a security perspective, because if you are too prescriptive in your requirements, then you run the risk that solution developers are going to literally follow what you specify as the requirement definer, and the solutions will end up less secure than if you would give developers the option to have that creativity and innovative view on how to develop solutions and secure solutions. And they are effectively also responsible for the security side. So doing something according to the law, letter of the law, is very different than developing something following the intention of the law. And that's, I think, the biggest change with MPoC, moving from the so-called prescriptive nature of the requirements to what they call more objective-based requirements, which leave the freedom of implementation to the developer, but stating clearly what objective the requirements have and what the developer essentially needs to achieve, not how he needs to do it. This also has an impact on what will be certified going forward. So with CPOC and with CPOC and SPOC, there was no clear threshold in terms of how secure, and with secure we mean how resistant against expert attackers and specific attacks, the solution needed to be. There was a rating methodology, an attack costing framework, but there was no definition of what you minimally needed to pass in order to be considered secure enough. That focus has now shifted to what we call a more attacker-resistant view on the certification process, which effectively means that the solutions going for MPoC, they will have to prove during the certification process that they are secure enough, meaning they can withstand expert attackers to a certain threshold. If you already had the opportunity to read the MPoC standard, you will see in different sections when it comes to software-based protections or the attestation system or protection of keys, is that there's an actual threshold of 25 points, which is determined based on the attack costing framework. And that's a very clear definition, a very clear bar, effectively, of what you need to be able to pass. So regardless of all the functional items, of all the procedural or documentation related requirements, the main impact which MPoC brings for someone who already has a solution, for instance, is there will of course be some aspects you need to take into account, maybe update your solution, but I think the biggest impact is on how robust your solution needs to be against attackers in order to be able to achieve the required level of attacker resistance. And this applies to all three main aspects in your solution: to the protection of your cryptographic keys, when the cryptographic operations, which are effectively used to protect your assets, such as the PIN data, the pen data, the transaction data, perhaps merchant credentials or other assets, protection of the code from a reversing or a tampering perspective, as well as protection of the A&M system, so the attestation and monitoring system, giving you as a solution developer effectively insight whether the platform is still in a trusted state, whether that still is secure enough and resistant against attacks itself.
Yeah, and Tim, that's the interesting part of it, right? Because you bring up something interesting, the move away from specialized hardware and to a COTS device. And if you took up mobile phones, which are everywhere, and they are, you go to India and you go to the East, devices are a lot less expensive, which means the hardware is probably not the best because they're trying to make phones for different markets.
Yeah.
And since you cannot rely on, it's not specialized hardware, and you have to rely on the hardware configuration of a consumer phone, your attack surface is completely changed. You can't take it for granted anymore, right? So when you talk about cryptographic key, code, assets, now you're suddenly find yourself having to worry about, is the device as safe as I thought? And we know it isn't. Then what do you need to do, right? Now, because even when attestation and monitoring, is something we deal with as Imperium quite a bit, because we know the device does so much, right? It connects to Wi-Fi's, it can download apps, it can, click on links. And you get into this and you suddenly realize the device is so vulnerable by itself that now you have to account for it. And a lot of things you're talking about, if I'm a solution developer for POS, I'm thinking, I'm having to worry about things I didn't have to worry about before. I could kind of take it for granted and say, that's fine. The hardware manufacturer or vendor took care of it, but now you don't have that luxury.
No, that's precisely the point. And this is also recognized by the standard and PCI itself. So whereas with the old standards, there's a lot of focus in testing the underlying hardware platform, testing the chips, testing the physical tamper resistance, the ability to get access to the PCB. With MPoC, that's not applicable at all. So that's simply not the case. What you see there is that the focus has shifted much more to how is the application protected from people having malicious intent with physical access or remote access or logical access to the application itself. And one of the core assumptions you will also find in the standard is that the default assumption is that that the platform cannot be trusted. It can be rooted, it can be vulnerable, but you need to have the ability to determine if the platform poses a risk to your application across all the different types of handsets on which your app is running. So this takes a very different view on how to secure these type of solutions, because you kind of have to look inside out instead of being able to fully rely on the platform for this. And what we effectively see here is there's, instead of relying on the platform to do everything for you, you kind of move to what we call a layered security when it comes to mobile application security. So it's not just one layer of protection you need to have, like I'm going to obfuscate my application and that's enough. That will not suffice with MPoC. It's multiple layers of protections, multiple different security countermeasures, as we call them. You could think of root detection, instrumentation detection, trying to see if people are trying to tamper with your application, whether your application has been modified, obfuscating or encrypting the binary, protecting all the cryptographic keys and operations, protecting all the data in transit. And by combining effectively all these countermeasures, you'll see that it becomes very difficult for attackers, including the labs, that's the good part for you as a developer, to actually compromise the application and get access to the assets. So it's really a combination of the different security mechanisms which will enforce each other and making it more and more difficult for attackers, but also labs, to get full access to the assets. And that's also what you see reflected in the threshold which PCI effectively defined. This is also how they look at security of these type of applications. They have what you call a procedure to determine if an attack is rated or needs to be rated, and that depends on whether it's a partial attack. For instance, I'm able to de-obfuscate obfuscated code. That's just one security mechanism. It's not a full attack. But the question is then, is this your only layer of it or only layer of defense, or do you have multiple layers? And all these type of things have to be taken into consideration. And effectively, your attestation and monitoring system is playing a vital role here, because even if attacks do happen and you are able to detect an occurrence of an attack to your app or a risk to your app, and you're able to mitigate or stop the risk or attack before it's actually resulted in disclosure of your assets, then it means that the attack is not successful and no attack rating has to be applied. So the impact of the A&M system is quite significant in such MPoC solutions. If there are attacks which are successful, then it's up to the lab effectively to determine how strong the attack is, or how much time it would take an attacker to pull it off, what type of expertise is required, if the attack is scalable or not, if he needs access to specific confidential information, and all these criteria will, in the end, through a rating methodology, lead up to a certain threshold, a certain number, effectively, which then represents the resistance against attacks, and that number needs to be above the threshold which is defined by PCI.
Sense. Right. So let's quickly get a poll question going. see what others have to say. So the question, folks, that you should see in front of you is, what are your key concerns regarding securing your MPoC SDK or application when taking the MPoC attacker resistance threshold into consideration? And Tim, this is exactly what you talk about, right? Now, there is a minimum threshold that you have to worry about. It essentially is a bar that's saying, do you have enough security in there?
Yeah, is it resist enough? And this is already quite common in other domains. So in chipsets, which you also have in your debit or your credit card, these chips are tested according to a certain methodology, and attacks are also rated there. So in the hardware domain, it's already an established practice, effectively, to rate these type of attacks and calculate whether the attacker resistance is above a certain threshold. For software, this has proven to be quite challenging, not only with SoftPOS solutions, also with other type of payment solutions or software in general. But it's quite good to see that PCI has made a very strong effort to define this, because this in the end will be pivotal also for the success of the technology. If solutions are released and they are starting to get compromised on scale, that will also undermine the trust of the audience, the merchants, to use these type of solutions going forward. So it is also, I think, in our interest to have a minimum level of security which is well defined, which we find acceptable as the payment ecosystem, effectively, instead of just allowing everything as long as it complies with the requirements.
Yeah, and Tim, I'm looking at the results, and it looks like 65% saying it's a combination, right? Protecting keys, protecting against reversing, and attestation and monitoring, right? Which is really great, because those three elements are really the foundation of what MPoC is trying to do. So again, folks, thank you for answering the poll. And as you can see, this is an area where Zimperium, as an application security solution vendor, is heavily focused on. Today, we are working with several SoftPOS vendors. And a lot of them like what we do, because a lot of our solutions, right, we have a mobile application protection suite that doesn't address one or two, but addresses all these things to a level where you will be compliant, right? So as Tim mentioned, if you're a SoftPOS developer, you're now having to go back and assess security and embrace security that helps you get above a threshold. It seems like it's a lot of work, but when you choose the right vendor to partner with, it's very easy to have sufficient security. And then more importantly, it gives you security at scale, right? The layered security model helps you. Then you're not worried about which Android device, which iOS, what if I go to Harmony OS, right? Choosing to partner with the right vendor will give you that. There will be an initial ramp up, but you will get the security that's absolutely mandated by PCI. And to the question that was asked before, yes, Zimperium's mobile application protection suite will help you become compliant with PCI. That's something we have factored in while building the solution suite. So Tim, I mean, you talk to these vendors a lot more than I do. I mean, some common questions. Maybe you can pick 2-3 of those and tell me which one do you get the most?
Well, let's start with the simple ones. A common question often is, can I use triple DES in my SoftPOS solution because my HSM is still supporting triple DES and my customers need it? The simple answer is no. This is not supported anymore from a PCI perspective going forward. And yeah, it's good to be aware that also with the PTS devices, the support for triple DES is being phased out, but in a different timeline due to the installed base or the legacy installed base, which is already there. But you have already seen that with SPoC and CPoC, they were quite reluctant in supporting this. There were some ways around it, but with MPoC becoming the default standard, you can use it technically, sure, but it will certainly endanger your ability to get PCI MPoC certified. So think twice before going that route.
One more, Tim, in the interest of time. What's your other favorite question that comes your way?
Well, something we've seen quite a bit. Yeah, I like them all. Something I've seen quite a few times is now that the lab says that my current code protection tool is not good enough. So that might be an interesting one to dive into a little bit. What you'll see in this space is that there are different vendors you can choose to partner with to provide you essentially your security technology to secure your SoftPOS solution. That could be the case for whiteboard cryptography. You could make use of certain hardware platform-based features. You have different providers for code obfuscation and runtime protection, etc. Effectively, with all these solutions, it is not a binary choice of if I take a code protection tool, an obfuscator, or a runtime protection tool, now my code is secure enough. There's actually quite a large variety in terms of the capabilities and maturity of these solutions, but also what level of attacker resistance they effectively introduce into your solution. And this is partially configuration based. So even with the best tool, you can completely mess up and end up with a bad or an insecure solution. But the other way around, you also have very poor solutions, which even if used to their max, will not get you past the certification process with MPoC. And this is something to take into account. Choose your technology right to go through this process. Because if you don't, and that is especially going to be the case once MPoC really kicks off, there's only so many labs. There's like 5, 6 of them. Probably the core of the work will be done by 3 of them, having the most experience. If you are failing a pen test, that will definitely impact your time to market and also cost. And it will also lead to the situation that you, at that point in time, might have to reconsider what tools you're using to protect your SoftPOS solution. So it's best to make sure that you do this now before you actually go for certification, than that you have to do it during the certification process itself, impacting your time to market, costs, etc.
Yeah, and folks, in the interest of time, so one of the reasons Imperium has been thriving and really helping several of the SoftPOS vendors is, one, we have a suite of security solutions, as I mentioned before, that allow you to address all these different things, right? Securing your code, securing your keys, building the right technology to begin with, and runtime protection and attestation and monitoring. We not only have the solution, one of the things that I think our customers deeply appreciate is how do you go about embracing these things, right? Where do you start? How do you get past the certification, the lab, as Tim is saying? Because without that, you could end up spending a lot of time and a lot of money and slowing down your time to market. And we're not only providing the products that help with this, but also providing some guidelines and best practices and how to configure this technology to really suit your needs. And that's been deeply appreciated by all our customers in this space. Tim, anything before we talk about where they can go and learn more about how we can help them?
Maybe there's a few questions in the question section. We could address those. There, I think, are so feel free to ask any question you might have. They pop up here, and we can address them. There are 2 now. So is Imperium AI attestation and PIN solution complementary to an MPoC SDK, or a way for developers to meet PCI standard? So effectively, those 2 specific components are libraries you would integrate in your MPoC SDK or MPoC software in terminology of PCI, in order to develop a solution which can meet the PCI standard. So the choice you have, for instance, for the secure PIN solution, is develop it yourself, or taking component which is developed by effectively by mobile security experts using the technology we have in house. And that also goes for the attestation solution we have. That's called the CDefend solution. That's also a library you would integrate in your SDK or your MPoC software, and effectively enables you to implement part of the attestation and monitoring system.
Yeah. The other question, Tim, is when we say protecting assets, it says, is it general PII, or are we talking only payment card PIN expiration data?
That's a good question. So the MPoC standard defines effectively already a subset of the assets you should consider, and that includes the primary focus on payment assets. So that is the PIN, the pen, the transaction data. It could be parts of the code of the application itself if they are closely involved in dealing with the PIN and the pen, for instance. It could be cryptographic keys. But depending on, I can imagine that depending on specific areas where you would deploy your solution, you might also want to make sure that specific PII data, to the extent they are really inside the device, need to be protected. But this might fall outside of the scope of PCI. I'm not sure on that aspect. I'm not a privacy expert in that sense.
Great, thank you, Tim. Folks, we're at 45 minutes now. Obviously, there's significant additional resources that you could go and learn about how our solutions are helping achieve MPoC compliance. How are we helping accelerate your speed to market and pass your pen tests? There's some information here. You'll see some information in the email follow-up. But if you are in this space and you're just looking to even have a conversation with Tim around guidance around what you use today and how you can achieve compliance, absolutely reach out to us on LinkedIn or it's Imperium. You can just contact us and let them know that you're looking to have an MPoC conversation, and we'll find a way to get to you. Tim, any last words before we wrap up?
Yeah, one thing. So we had that first polling question on when do you expect the MPoC standard to be published? Well, that turned out to be a little bit old news, given that the standard was published yesterday, just before we uploaded the material to the conference environment. But it's good to realize that this is only the set of security requirements. So this is very helpful for you as a developer or a company moving into this space to understand what is expected from you. But this doesn't mean that you can already certify your solution as an MPoC solution. One critical document called a program guide is still not available, and that's expected to be published in the coming months. But that document is effectively required for the labs to be able to start the certification process with you or submit reports to PCI. So you have time now to dive into the requirements, understand what you need to do. You can consult your lab, your experts, your solution providers to see how you can best prepare for MPoC effectively. But at the moment, the program guide is published, and the labs also have the templates for the reporting, etc. And PCI has set up its portal. That's the moment actual certifications can effectively start and be uploaded to the PCI Council for approval, for certification. And that might have been a better question, because that's not here yet, and we don't know when that will come. Could be still this year, but maybe also in the course of next year.
Thanks, Tim. Folks, again, thank you so much for spending the time with us talking about MPoC. As I mentioned, feel free to reach out if you want to have more conversations and you want to understand how Zimperium is helping all the SoftPOS vendors out there go to market and achieve their security goals. So with that, thank you so much. And Tim, thank you so much for your time and having the conversation.
Likewise, it was fun.
Thank you.
We'll see. Cheers.